Not let them go. Listen, oh listen, oh listen to Paro. Listen, please listen, let my people go. We work so hard each day, we want to go away. Paro, King Paro, what do you say? No, 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 I will not let them go. No, 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 I will not let them go. Tra-la-la, we sing with glee of this great nation history. Hashem who set our nation free will serve until eternity. Tra-la-la, we sing with glee of this great nation history. Hashem who set our nation free will serve until eternity. Aha, aha.
Water turned to blood.
Frogs were everywhere.
Lice that came from mud. Wild animals here and there. A plague that left them dead.
Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. That was Uncle Moishi. What's actually the name of this song? It's just called Pesach, Passover. But with that famous song, frogs were in Pharaoh's bed, frogs on his head, frogs everywhere. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be learning together on the second to last page of Tractate Pesachim. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we get it going on a nice Sunday night? Here we go. Stephen in New Hampshire, Pauline in Arkansas, Yehudis in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, John in Sedona, Crystal in British Columbia, Renee in Indy, James in Indy, Gail in Virginia, Lucy in Minnesota, Randy in Florida, Matt in Eau Claire, Ann in Merced, Donna in Bahama, North Carolina, Jim in Newport, New Hampshire, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Robert wishing everyone peace to the Havarim, Larry in Queens, Steve in Tallahassee, Judy in Northern Virginia, and Robert says it's Monday morning over here. Where are you, Robert? You must be pretty far to the east if it's already Monday. Welcome everybody over there on the YouTube side. Neil in Virginia, Lynn in North Texas. Also Paul in Minneapolis. All right, let's get it going. We're really coming into the big finish. Where are we? This is Daf Kuf Chaf, right? Daf Kuf Chaf, page 120. Woo! Page 120 of Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We are in chapter 10. Today, completing our discussion of the 7th Mishnah and the 8th Mishnah. We're almost finishing it. And then tomorrow will be the last page when we'll discuss the final Mishnah, the 9th Mishnah. But we won't actually complete the page. We'll leave just a few lines of the page, and we'll finish those on Thursday of this week so that we can make the siyum on the day of the fast of the firstborn. And then when we make a celebration on completing a tractate, we can make a l'chaim and eat a little bit, and that will excuse us from the fast. Who is obligated to fast on the day of the fast of the firstborn? The firstborn male children of a Jewish mom is who's obligated, but it's a very minor fast, and we can get out of it by making a siyum that day. So we'll be almost completing the last page of Tractate Pesachim tomorrow, Monday. And Tuesday, we'll start Tractate Shekalim with God's help. All right, let's get into it. We've been working our way through chapter 10. That is all about the Seder itself. And this Mishnah number 7, we've been talking about the afikoman. We started yesterday. The afikoman, so ironic, right? Anyone who's been to a Seder at least a few times will remember that the last thing we eat at the Seder is the afikoman, a piece of matzah, right? The larger half of that middle matzah that we broke and separated before the festive meal. Then we enjoy the festive meal. Then we bring back, sometimes there's a search for it, a kind of game that is traditionally played. But then we bring back that larger piece and everybody eats a piece of that matzah, the afikoman. And that's the last thing that we eat at the Seder. And the seventh Mishnah said, one does not conclude after the Korban Pesach eating the Paschal lamb with an afikoman. So doesn't that sound like exactly the opposite of what we do? And of course, the answer is when the temple was destroyed, we could no longer bring the Korban Pesach. We cannot bring the Paschal lamb, and so we don't eat the Paschal lamb at Passover. Instead, the central feature, the central food that we eat is matzah. And the idea of this Mishnah, once the Gemara gets into the commentary on it, is that now that we don't eat the lamb, what we would have wanted when we do eat the Paschal lamb at Passover, that the last thing we should taste that night is the lamb itself, so that we remember that's what we're all about. That's what this ritual is. It reminds us of when God brought us out of Egypt and then obligated us to eat that Paschal lamb at Passover, to bring that offering. We can't bring that offering, and so the matzah sort of comes forward as the central feature of the Seder. And afikoman really means the treat that you eat at the end of the meal. And so now what the Gemara is teaching us is after we finish the festive meal, maybe we'll have some dessert, but after the dessert, the final thing that we eat at the Seder has to be matzah. The last thing that we taste at a Passover Seder needs to be matzah. Of course, there will be the third and fourth cups of wine after the meal, but those are serving their own obligation. We are obligated to drink the third and fourth cup of wine. But in terms of food, the last thing that we need to eat at the Seder, the last thing that we taste, the last taste that we bring away from the Seder has to be matzah. We continue. I'll just repeat the line that we finished with yesterday. Let us say that the Tosefta, right? So Tosefta just about contemporaneous with the Mishnah, but with a little bit of a gloss of commentary on it. Let us say that the Tosefta supports the ruling of Shmuel. With regard to unleavened sponge cakes, cakes fried in oil and honey cakes, a person may fill his stomach with them on Passover night, provided that he eats an olive bulk of matzah after all that food. So you can eat sweet things at the meal. You can even eat unleavened bread that is essentially matzah, but flavored with other things, and that's why it's not the official matzah. You can eat those things, but still, then you have to eat some more matzah afterwards so that the last thing you eat is matzah. However, if one eats matzah before these other foods, no, one may not start eating other foods after matzah. The Mishnah apparently supports Rav Yehuda's opinion, and the Gemara rejects this proof. The Tosefta is stated in the style of needless to say, meaning, needless to say, one fulfills his obligation if he eats matzah before other foods, as he eats it with an appetite. However, if one eats matzah after eating other foods, perhaps he will come to eat it in the manner of excessive eating, as he is compelled to eat when he is not hungry, and consequently you might say that he does not fulfill his obligation if he eats matzah after all those other foods. Therefore, the Tosefta teaches us that one may eat matzah even after consuming those foods. Now, here what's being said is something a little different. We want to finish so that the final thing that we taste is matzah. Okay, that's a rabbinic decree telling us that in honor of the festival, the last thing we should eat at the Passover Seder is matzah. A different question is implied by this reasoning, and that is this. Well, what if you didn't eat any matzah before you ate the festive meal? Now, you're not supposed to do that. We know that before we get to the festive meal, we're going to say a blessing on matzah in terms of the blessing on bread and the blessing of the mitzvah, meaning, blessed you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with commandments and commanded us to eat matzah, because it's a Torah obligation. There's a dispute about that, as we'll see, but still, they finally say it's a Torah obligation to eat matzah at the Passover Seder. Okay, but what if you didn't eat matzah before the festive meal? Then you ate the festive meal, and only then you ate some matzah, after you were already full. So then the question is, you had matzah on the night of Passover, but you only ate it after you ate all that other food rather than eating it before the meal. did you fulfill your obligation to eat matzah on the night of Passover? You might have thought that you didn't fulfill your obligation because by the time you ate your matzah, you were already full, and so you weren't eating it with an appetite, which is the optimal way to eat matzah at the time that you're fulfilling your obligation to eat matzah. And the Gemara answers, that's not the right way, that's not the best way, but if that's what you did, you ate matzah on the night of Passover, even though you were already kind of full, and you did fulfill your obligation. It's not the right way to do it, but if you did it after the fact, yes, you fulfilled your obligation to eat matzah that night. The Gemara then restates that argument with only a subtle difference, so we're going to skip that because there's a lot to cover tonight. Skip down a few lines to Rava said, the mitzvah of matzah nowadays, the commandment, the obligation of matzah nowadays, meaning after the temple was destroyed and we can no longer bring the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, the Paschal lamb. After the destruction of the temple, according to Rava, the commandment to eat matzah is a Torah commandment. It is a Torah obligation as opposed to a rabbinic decree. But the mitzvah to eat bitter herbs is a rabbinic decree, not a Torah obligation. Right? What is the difference between them? Why would the bitter herbs not be a Torah obligation? It says in the Torah you're going to eat bitter herbs on Passover night. But in the Torah what it says is you shall eat the Paschal lamb with matzah and bitter herbs. So why is it that the matzah is a Torah obligation now that the temple is destroyed and we can't eat the lamb anymore, but the matzah, eating it that night, remains a Torah obligation, whereas eating bitter herb, which was supposed to be an accompaniment to the lamb, that's a Torah obligation that when you eat the lamb on Passover night, you eat bitter herbs with it. But since we don't eat the lamb anymore, why do we still eat the bitter herb? Because the sages said we must do it. So it's a rabbinic decree. It is not a Torah obligation to eat bitter herbs on Passover night, but it is a rabbinic obligation, and it has a full force of law for us. The question is, why does the matzah remain a Torah obligation while the bitter herbs is sort of, degraded a little bit? Not degraded, but I mean, it's just a little bit lower level obligation. It's a rabbinic decree rather than a Torah obligation. What is the difference between them? The Gemara asks, and in what way is the mitzvah of bitter herbs different than matzah? As it is written with regard to the Paschal lamb, they shall eat it with matzahs and bitter herbs. That's Numbers 9:11, from which it is derived, when there is an obligation to eat the Paschal lamb, there is likewise a mitzvah to eat bitter herbs. And when there is no obligation to eat the Paschal lamb, there is no Torah obligation to eat bitter herbs. And so, of course, the Gemara asks, but if so, the same reasoning should apply to matzah as well, as it is written, with matzahs and bitter herbs. So the mitzvah of matzah should also depend on the obligation of the Paschal lamb. And the Gemara rejects this contention, saying the verse repeats the obligation to eat matzah, as it states in another part of the Torah at Exodus 12:18, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, you shall eat matzahs. This verse establishes a separate obligation to eat matzah unrelated to the Paschal lamb. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, nowadays, meaning after the temple was destroyed, both this, the mitzvah to eat matzah, and that, the mitzvah to eat bitter herbs, apply only by rabbinic law, as the Torah obligation to eat these foods is in effect only when the Paschal lamb is sacrificed. Before I continue with this analysis, I will just say, what is the law? Where did this discussion end up? Nowadays, the mitzvah to eat matzah is a Torah obligation, as the mitzvah applies at all times and is not dependent on the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb. This ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rava, and the Baraisa cited in support of that opinion. The law is not in accordance with this opinion that we're reading now of Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. However, the obligation to eat bitter herbs since the temple was destroyed the mitzvah to eat bitter herbs is contingent upon the Paschal lamb, as bitter herbs accompany the offering. Therefore, by Torah law, this obligation applies only when the temple is standing. The sages, however, ruled that bitter herbs must be eaten nowadays as well. What is the practical difference between them? As we've seen, when something is a Torah obligation and there's some doubt of whether you've done it or not, whether it's done correctly or not, you're going to rule stringently. When something is a rabbinic obligation and there's some doubt whether you've done it or not, or whether, which way to make a ruling on a particular question, we're going to rule leniently. Continuing, the Gemara challenges this opinion of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who said that both matzah and bitter herbs are only by rabbinic obligation after the temple is destroyed. The Gemara challenges Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov. But isn't it written, in the evening you shall eat matzahs? And the Gemara answers, Rav Acha bar Yaakov needs that verse for the following halacha. When the temple was standing, one who was tameh, ritually impure, or one who was on a distant road, was nonetheless obligated to eat matzah, as it could enter your mind to say that since these two categories of people, somebody who's ritually impure, for example, because he helped bury a dead body and he touched a corpse, became tameh, now he's disqualified from bringing the korban Pesach. So then the question is, but does he eat matzah? He's disqualified from the lamb. Is he still obligated to eat matzah? As it could enter your mind to say that since these two categories of people do not eat the Paschal lamb on the first Pesach, they also do not eat matzah and bitter herbs. According to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, this verse teaches us that even one who was ritually impure and one who was on a distant road are obligated to eat matzah and bitter herbs, as these mitzvahs do not depend on one's eligibility to sacrifice the Paschal lamb on the first Pesach. In other words, even when the temple was standing, there were some people who could not bring the Paschal lamb, namely someone who was tameh because he had touched a dead body or had touched a creeping thing or was having some kind of an emission, etc. He's disqualified from bringing the lamb, or he's too far away to get to Jerusalem, and so he's excused from bringing the Paschal lamb. Nevertheless, he still had to eat matzah even when the temple was standing. The Gemara asks, and Rava, who maintains that it is a mitzvah from the Torah to eat matzah even nowadays, how could he respond to the interpretation of the verse of Rav Acha bar Yaakov? Rava could have said to you, I do not require a special verse to teach that a ritually impure person or a person who is on a distant road are obligated to eat matzah. These people are obligated because they are no worse than an uncircumcised man or an alien. In other words, one who does not observe the mitzvahs, who are obligated to eat matzah despite the fact that they do not sacrifice the Paschal lamb. So the Paschal lamb, one of the requirements to eat it, right? This is only an obligation. It only applies to Jews, right? So non-Jews don't do this. And not only that, but in terms of a Jewish man, only a circumcised Jewish man, right? The circumcision of a Jewish man brings him into the covenant of the Jewish people. So if a woman is just automatically, if she's born into it, she's part of the covenant. The man needs to be circumcised. If he's not circumcised, then he's prohibited from eating the Paschal lamb, which of course is only brought when the temple is standing. But even though he's not qualified to eat the Paschal lamb, nevertheless, he's a Jew and he's obligated to eat matzah on that night. Maybe so, disconnected from Judaism and the commandments that he's not going to do either one. But whereas he's excused from eating the lamb, it would be a transgression for him to not eat matzah on the first night of Passover. That is an obligation on every Jew. And that's what Rav is explaining. As it was taught in a Baraisa, but no uncircumcised man shall eat from it. From it indicates that he may not eat from the Paschal lamb. However, he does eat matzah and bitter herbs. And the same is true for anyone else who is prevented from eating the Paschal lamb. Maybe they can't eat the Paschal lamb, but if they're Jewish, they're obligated to eat matzah and bitter herbs on the first night of Passover. The Gemara asks, and the other, Rav Acha bar Yaakov, how does he respond to this argument of Rava? And the Gemara answers, according to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, the halacha, the law, that one must eat matzah and bitter herbs despite being unable to partake of the Paschal lamb, was written with regard to this person, an uncircumcised man, and it was written also with regard to that one, a ritually impure person. And both verses are necessary. We cannot learn the law of the ritually impure person from the law of the uncircumcised man, or vice versa, as is explained in other places. The Gemara comments, it was taught in a, and that's where the argument is left, but as I say, the law is every Jew is obligated to eat matzah on Passover night as a Torah obligation, and every Jew is obligated to eat bitter herbs on Passover night by rabbinic decree. The Gemara comments, it was taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rava. 6 days you shall eat matzahs, and on the 7th day shall be a solemn assembly to the Lord your God. That's Deuteronomy 16:8. Now, just as eating matzah on the 7th day is merely optional, i.e. there is no obligation to eat matzah on the last day of Passover, but only to avoid eating leavened bread, as the verse states, 6 days you shall eat matzahs, so too eating matzah during the first 6 days is optional. What is the reason that it is optional to eat matzah on the first 6 days of Passover as well as the 7th? Now, here we're going to get into a little bit of the techniques that the sages use to interpret, to do exegesis and understand laws that aren't overtly written, but are implied strongly by the Torah. So the 7th day of Passover is something that was included in a generalization, but was explicitly singled out to teach. According to the rule of exegesis, it was intended to teach not just about itself, but about the entire generalization. In other words, the 7th day of Passover was initially included in the verse, you shall eat matzahs for 7 days. That's Exodus 12:15. But it was excluded from this generalization by the verse, 6 days shall you eat matzahs. In accordance with the above principle, the halach of the 7th day applies to all the other days of Passover as well. And that means that there is no obligation to eat matzah for all 7 days of the festival, but only on the first day. So where we are is, it's a Torah obligation to eat matzah on that first night of Passover. That's in the land of Israel. Outside of Israel, because the first day is a 2-day holiday, so it's an obligation to eat matzah on the first 2 days of Passover, the first 2 nights of Passover. You must eat matzah on the first 2 nights of Passover. For the remainder of the festival, it is optional. You may not eat leavened bread, but you don't have to eat matzah, at least in terms of the biblical obligation to eat matzah on the first 2 days of Passover. As we'll see, it's optional to eat matzah the rest of the days, but there actually is an obligation to eat matzah for a different reason. And the Baraisa continues, I might have thought that even the mitzvah to eat matzah on the first night of Passover is included by the above principle, as it too is merely optional. Therefore, the verse states, they shall eat it with matzah and bitter herbs. You must eat matzah on the first night of Passover and outside of Israel on the first 2 nights. Now, I have derived nothing other than that one is obligated to eat matzah when the temple is standing. From where is it derived that one is obligated to eat matzah on the first night of Passover, even when the temple is not standing? The verse states, in the evening you shall eat matzahs. The verse here establishes the mitzvah of matzah as obligatory in accordance with the opinion of Rava. That is the law. But now listen to this. Eating matzah is obligatory only on the first night of Passover in Israel and the first 2 nights outside of Israel. From that point onward, it is optional to consume matzah during the remainder of the festival. Although one is obligated to eat a meal of matzah each day in honor of the festival, one may use rich enhanced matzah, meaning matzah made with oil or honey, for this purpose after the first night. Some authorities say it is a mitzvah to eat matzah throughout the festival of Passover. So the point is, you don't have to eat matzah, like pure matzah, the kind of matzah that we use to fulfill our obligation to eat matzah on the first night. You don't have to eat that kind of matzah during the rest of the days of the 7-day festival, or 8 days outside of Israel. However, in honor of the festival, on each day, you should be celebrating that we're still in the festival of matzahs. After all, it's called the festival of matzahs. It's a week-long festival. And so even though the Chol HaMoed days, the intermediate days between the full-fledged festival at the beginning of Passover and the full-fledged festival at the end of Passover, during those intermediate days, you can work. Not everybody does, but most people probably, it's certainly permissible to do more labor than is allowed on a festival day or on Shabbos. Nevertheless, you should have some kind of a festive meal every day. And that means a meal. And what is a meal? A meal means bread. That you're gonna wash your hands and then make the motzi over the bread. But we don't eat leavened bread during Passover, so you're gonna have to use matzah in order to have a meal. So it's not the obligation, like, bless you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with the commandments and commands us concerning the matzah, or commands us to eat matzah. That's something only on the first night. But during the rest of the festival, just to honor the festival, we should have nice meals, and we should wash and make a motzi over bread. But the bread of Passover is unleavened bread, so you're going to need to eat some matzah on each day with your meals. But it doesn't have to be pure matzah, right? It can be that enhanced matzah, flavored matzah, matzah made with some additional ingredients like oil or honey. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7. We're now near the bottom of the A side of page 120, beginning Mishnah number 8. If some of the participants at the Seder fell asleep, how could that possibly happen? I mean, don't we have a leader of the Seder who's scintillating and fascinating and keeps it energetic and fun and fascinating and interesting for everybody so that they would never fall asleep? But it gets late into the night and we're drinking wine. We had to have 2 cups of wine, not just a little sip, like 2 cups of wine even before the festive meal. Then we eat a beautiful festive meal. I mean, people fall asleep. It happens. It happens. So, if some of the participants at the Seder fell asleep, thereby interrupting their meal, presumably they didn't fall asleep while we were reading the Haggadah before the festive meal, but let's say they fell asleep during the meal and before the end of the meal itself and before what comes later, the grace after the meal and the Hallel that we recite after the meal. So if some of them fell asleep, interrupting their meal, they may eat from the Paschal lamb when they awake. If, however, the entire company fell asleep, they may not eat the Paschal lamb anymore. If they all fall asleep, this is considered a complete interruption. And if they were to resume their meal, it would be akin to eating the Paschal lamb in 2 different places. And as we've already seen, when the temple is standing and we bring the Paschal lamb, the group that is registered agreed in advance that they're going to be the ones that share this particular Paschal lamb. They slaughter it in the temple, then they bring it out, they bring it to the place where they're all going to have their dinner, and then they all need to eat that lamb in that place. They can't get up and go join another group. They can't take part of the lamb and eat it somewhere else. They have to eat that whole lamb in that place. And if some of the lamb is left over after the night, then it needs to be burned. And at what time is it considered left over? We're going to get to that a little later. But the point is, if they all fall asleep, then it's considered as if the meal is ended. And then when they wake up, they can't keep eating the Paschal lamb. Rabbi Yosei says, if they dozed, they may eat from the Paschal lamb when they awake. But if they fell asleep, they may not eat from it. So what is the difference between dozing and sleeping? The sages further said the Paschal lamb after midnight renders one's hands ritually impure as it becomes nasar, an offering that remained after the time when it is permitted to be eaten. Once you go past that time, that offering has expired. It may no longer be eaten. And not only that, but if you touch it, it's as if you touched an impure thing, and it renders your hands tameh, ritually impure. And now they need to be washed and purified before you can go touch, for example, teruma, which if you touched it with impure hands, you would render the teruma impure, and then the priest, who's the only person allowed to eat it, would no longer be able to eat it because you made it impure. And the sages ruled that both pigul, meaning offerings that at the time they were slaughtered, already the priest had the wrong intention in mind that he was going to eat it past the time when it was going to be expired, and offerings that were invalidated, pigul, offerings that were invalidated due to inappropriate intent while being sacrificed, and nasar, offerings that are still around after their time has expired. Both of these, pigul and nasar, render one's hands ritually impure. That's Mishnah number 8. Now the Gemara. We learned in the Mishnah that Rabbi Yosei says, if they dozed, they may eat from the Paschal lamb when they wake up. But if they fell asleep, they may not eat from it. And so the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of dozing? Meaning, what is the difference between dozing and sleeping? Rav Ashi said, one is asleep, but not asleep. Awake, but not awake. When? If they call him, he will answer, but he is unable to provide a reasonable answer. And when they later inform him of what happened, he remembers it. Okay? So that's a beautiful Talmudic definition. What is this in-between state that is not awake, but is not asleep? It's not awake, but it's not awake. It's not asleep, but it's not asleep. What is that in-between state, which we're calling dozing here? It's when, if they talk to you, you answer, but the answer you give is like gibberish. But later, when they ask you, do you remember that they asked you a question? And you're like, yeah, I remember it. That is that in-between, that liminal in-between state. And, I think that most of us, at least, adults who are of a certain age, who watch TV at night and with your partner, and you're watching a movie, and your partner looks over you and says, Sal, are you asleep? I'm like, no, I'm not asleep. That's that state. Okay. The Gemara cites a related episode. Abaye was sitting before Rabbah, and he saw that Rabbah was dozing off after he had begun to eat the final obligatory piece of matzah. And he said to him, is the master sleeping? Rabbah said to him, I am dozing. And we learned in the Mishnah, if they dozed, they may eat from the Paschal lamb. But if they fell asleep, they may not eat from it. We learned in the Mishnah that the Paschal lamb, after midnight, renders one's hands ritually impure. And the Gemara infers, well, apparently, from midnight and onward, the Paschal lamb is classified as nasar. And the Gemara asks, who is the Tana who maintains this opinion? Now, we've already learned that the Paschal lamb you slaughtered in the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan when the temple is standing, and then you eat it that night of the 15th of Nisan, the Passover night, and any of it and you have to eat all of it that night. But if you leave some of it over, you have to burn it. Now, at what time in the night has the clock run out? Right? You would think it would be like at dawn, right? When the first light of the sky comes and it's no longer night. But now we're learning that after midnight, already it's expired. If you can't touch it without becoming impure, then certainly you can't eat it either. So why is it that we only have until midnight to eat the Paschal lamb when the temple is standing and not all night? Rav Yosef said, it is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah who has this opinion, as it was taught in a Baraisa, with regard to the verse at Exodus 12:8, and they shall eat of the meat on that night. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, here it is stated on that night. from which it cannot be determined when the night ends. And below it is stated at Exodus 12:12, and I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike every firstborn in the land of Egypt. And the Torah states with regard to the death of the firstborns, the 10th plague, at Exodus 11:4 and 5, thus said the Lord, at around midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn of Egypt shall die. And the Baraisa continues, just as in the verse below, the striking of the firstborns took place until midnight, as stated explicitly in the verse, so too, in the verse here, the mitzvah to eat the Paschal lamb continues until midnight, but not beyond. Evidently, the Paschal lamb may not be eaten after midnight. Now you might ask, the verse said around midnight. Why is that we're drawing a hard line at midnight? And the thing is, remember, they didn't have watches. They didn't have digital watches. They didn't have analog watches. Round midnight is about what they could estimate was midnight. But the point is midnight. So on that night, we define that as midnight is like the climax of that night. Right, that first Passover in Egypt when they were celebrating the first Passover, and then the angel of the Lord went out and slew the firstborns of the Egyptians, the 10th plague. That happened at midnight, and so we define on that night. Until when is it really on that night? Until midnight. Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, but wasn't it already stated, thus you shall eat it? This is Exodus 12:11. Thus you shall eat it, the Paschal lamb, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staffs in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste, for it is the Paschal offering for the Lord. This verse indicates that the Paschal lamb may be eaten until the time of haste. When did the children of Israel walk out of Egypt? In the morning, right? At daylight. That's when they hustled out of Egypt. Once it was daytime, they didn't leave when it was still dark. So the time of haste would seem to me the first light in the morning. So why are we saying that, no, you can only eat the Paschal lamb until midnight? Why not all night? And Rabbi Akiva continues, if that is so, what is the meaning when the verse states on that night with regard to eating the Paschal lamb? And the Gemara explains that this phrase is necessary, as I might have thought that the Paschal lamb is eaten during the day, like all other offerings, which must be slaughtered and eaten during the day. Therefore, the verse states on that night to underscore that this particular offering is not eaten during the day. This offering, unlike other offerings, is eaten at night. That's what we learned from on that night, according to Rabbi Akiva, who would have permitted us to eat the Paschal lamb all through the night, not with this cutoff at midnight. And the Gemara asks, and Rabbi Akiva, what does he do with the word that? He doesn't use it for the verbal analogy. What does Rabbi Akiva learn from this word? Meaning, before the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was saying on that night, he uses it to tie it to the 10th plague, and just as that happened at midnight, eating the Paschal lamb should be over by midnight. So what does Rabbi Akiva do with this word that, meaning connecting on that night in this verse to on that night in the other verse? What does Rabbi Akiva do with it? The Gemara answers, he needs it to exclude another night, because it could enter your mind to say that since the Paschal lamb falls into the category of offerings of lesser sanctity, and peace offerings are also offerings of lesser sanctity, as opposed to the holiest offerings like sin offerings and guilt offerings, which are brought when the temple is standing. The Paschal lamb is actually an offering of lesser sanctity than those offerings of higher sanctity. Another offering of lesser sanctity is the peace offering, which is eaten by the person who brings it, like the festival peace offerings. Now, with regard to festival peace offerings, where am I? It could enter your mind to say that since the Paschal lamb, I'm almost done, so get your questions and comments in there. It could enter your mind to say that since the Paschal lamb falls into the category of offerings of lesser sanctity, and peace offerings are also offerings of lesser sanctity, well, just as peace offerings may be eaten for 2 days and 1 night, i.e., the day they are sacrificed, that whole night afterward, and the whole next day, it's still qualified to be eaten, the peace offering, unlike the Paschal lamb, which has to be finished that night. So you might have thought, well, since these are both offerings of lesser sanctity, maybe the Paschal lamb should be able to be eaten the next day, i.e., the day they are sacrificed through the following day. As stated the Torah, so too the same halacha might apply to the Paschal lamb. And the Gemara explains the previous statement. How could the Paschal lamb be eaten for 2 days and 1 night if one starts eating it at night? And the Gemara explains, well, one may say, I will substitute the nights that the Paschal lamb may be eaten instead of the days that a peace offering is eaten. And accordingly, you might have thought that the Paschal lamb may be eaten for 2 nights and 1 day. Therefore, the Torah wrote the word that to teach that the Paschal lamb may be only eaten on that 1 night. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, from where might he derive the halacha that the Paschal lamb may not be eaten for 2 nights? And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah could have said to you, well, that law is derived from the verse, you shall let nothing of it remain until the morning. And that of it which remains until the morning you shall burn with fire. That's Exodus 12:10. It is prohibited to leave any part of the Paschal lamb until morning. If it is prohibited to leave any part of the Paschal lamb until morning, it is certainly prohibited to leave any of it until the following night. Therefore, it is unnecessary to cite an additional source to teach that the Paschal lamb may be eaten only on the first night. And Rabbi Akiva could have said to you in response to this argument, if the Torah hadn't written on that night, I would have said, what is indicated by the word morning in that verse? It means the second morning after the festival, meaning the day of the 16th of Nisan. Therefore, it was necessary for the Torah to write that one may eat the Paschal lamb only on that night and no other. And Rabbi Elazar could have said to you in response, anywhere that the Torah writes morning, it is referring to the first morning. If that were not the case, no biblical text could have any definitive meaning. And as we saw, we've traced through how Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah concludes that we have to finish eating the Paschal lamb by midnight when the temple is standing and we're bringing the Paschal lamb. We eat it at night and we have to be done eating it by midnight because that's when God slew the firstborn in Egypt. Rabbi Akiva said we have to eat it that night, but we can eat it all night until the time of haste, which is when we went out of Egypt in the morning. And what is the law of eating the Paschal lamb? Hold on. Well, it's not saying what the halacha is about eating the Paschal lamb. I do think that the halacha is in accordance with Elazar ben Azariah, because what we do know, and we're going to be looking at this tomorrow, one should be careful not to eat the final olive bulk portion of matzah, i.e. the afikoman, ending the meal with a bit of matzah, after midnight, as the ruling of the halacha is in accordance with the stringent opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Furthermore, the bitter herbs should also be eaten and halal recited before midnight. So clearly, with regard to with regard to matzah and these other accessories to the Paschal lamb, and we have to finish those by midnight, then clearly when the Paschal lamb is here, we have to finish that by midnight, and therefore the halacha, the law, is in accordance with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and not Rabbi Akiva. Finish the Paschal lamb by midnight when we can eat the Paschal lamb. When we don't have a Paschal lamb, we're eating matzah as the centerpiece of the Passover Seder, and we have to finish eating it by midnight, and ideally finish the whole Seder by midnight, at least in terms of what I just said, that the bitter herbs should also be eaten and the hallel recited before midnight. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let us check your comments and questions. Oops, this page has to reload. Here we go. Okay. Michael had a question with regard to yesterday's page, 119. Are we to take literally that all the world's wealth came to Egypt? I don't think we have to take literally that all the wealth in the world went to Egypt. But I think what we can take literally from that is that it wasn't just the wealth of Egypt and its neighbor to the northeast, as it were, Canaan, but rather that famine, that great famine, the 7 years of plenty followed by the 7 years of famine, extended not just to Egypt and Canaan, but a much larger area than that. And I mean, to the extent that people traveled in those days, it was abnormal to make a trip of many hundreds of miles or certainly thousands of miles. But nevertheless, I would say that what we should certainly believe is that many surrounding lands went to Egypt to purchase food during that famine, and Egypt's treasure was enormous, right? Enormous. But they were not able to hang on to that treasure. Just as the Egyptian empire finally had its sunset and fell from grace, as it were, and there were other much more powerful empires in the world, so too, I mean, there would be the Assyrian Empire, there would be the Greek Empire, there would be the Roman Empire, and at certain moments in history, they were by far the wealthiest empires, and so there was that transfer of wealth from the empire that they defeated to the new greatest power, but then eventually they fell, and so you could look at it, the next empire, which was the wealthiest. And so, of course, there's new wealth added, into the wealth of the nations over the centuries, but probably some of the wealth of the previous most powerful empire was transferred to the next, succession, the succeeding empire that came next as the most powerful. Sharon Frantbrooks, I just checked both the Kiddush for a Chol HaMoed Shabbos and the Shabbos Chol HaMoed table service in the Koren Passover Machzor. There is no reference to Chag HaMatzos or a matzah-specific blessing, just Hamotzi. I assume that reflects the non-obligatory status of Seder matzah. I think what you're saying is we have to eat matzah at the Seder, but you're confirming we don't have to make a bracha, we don't say a blessing over the mitzvah to eat matzah on the other days. Exactly. We should eat meals that include bread during Passover in honor of the celebration, all the 7 days of Passover, but we're just making a motzi, right? We're not fulfilling an obligation to eat matzah on those days. We're just fulfilling an obligation to have festive meals. And because they're meals, they need to have bread. But they don't have to have pure matzah, shmura matzah. It just has to be some kind of unleavened bread, even if it has honey or oil or other flavorings in it. Okay, so this is an off-topic question, but this is the last question. So Caroline asked, you've been discussing Exodus and Passover, but by the way, what are the requirements of confession of sin referenced in Leviticus? Must one confess to a rabbi? No, we don't have that kind of a relationship with rabbis, right? So when we're talking about confessing, that's when you're bringing a sin offering, right? Or a guilt offering. And we're going to be talking plenty about the various offerings in our 7.5-year journey through the Talmud. But when you confess over an offering, it's because the temple is standing. You're bringing the kind of offering that you bring because you've transgressed unwittingly, right? As we've seen, for example, when you make a Shabbos transgression, if you do it on purpose, you can't bring a chatas, a sin offering for that. It's only when you did it accidentally. So the sin offering only works for the unwitting violation of that Torah obligation. Now, does that mean that we don't have a chance to atone for our sins? No, of course. We can always atone for our sins. But the process of that isn't done through confessing, to a clergy person. You confess before God. Right? So you should say aloud before God what it is that you've done. You should understand what you've done. You should be able to articulate what you've done. If your transgression is against another person, you have to seek their forgiveness. So in that sense, you would need to confess to a person that you've hurt before you can obtain their forgiveness. You have to articulate what you did to them. But we don't confess to a rabbi as part of atonement, right? We confess before God, or we articulate our apology to a person that we've hurt, and then we have to organize our life in such a way that we're not going to repeat that transgression. I mean, maybe we'll fail, but we certainly have to make that attempt to organize our life in such a way that we would not repeat the transgression. If we're not trying to arrange our life so we never repeat it, then we're not really atoning for the sin. And what else was I going to say about that? And then, and then Rambam would say that you haven't fully atoned for your sin, even if you've articulated, even if you prayed for forgiveness from God, if it's a sin before God, or apologize to the person if it's a sin against another person, organize your life so that you wouldn't repeat that sin. You haven't completed your atonement until that opportunity to commit the same transgression arises again, and now you're strong enough to say no, right? You don't want to arrange for that to happen, but you should be mindful that, okay, I can't really say I'm over it until I've been tested. You don't arrange to test yourself, but you want to say to yourself, I haven't really been tested, so I have to maintain vigilance. I have to maintain caution that I would ever make that transgression again. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll do the last page tomorrow of Tractate Pesachim, but we won't make our siyum with the final lines of it until Thursday morning. That'll be a separate class, not really a class, but an AT Live for a siyum that's going to exempt us from the fast of the firstborn. And my plan is to do that at 8 a.m. 8 a.m. on Thursday, 8 a.m. Pacific. So that if people are going to be joining us from the East Coast, it's still happening before noon for them. And that's when we're going to do the CU on Thursday, 8 a.m. Pacific. Have a terrific night. All the best.